Erikson has 8 psychological stages where you encounter a crisis. At this crisis, it'll then divide you into one of 2 routes of identity that'll either make you more stable and be able to grow more as a person, or they will make you unstable and have difficulty growing. Erikson believes, though, that people can change and grow throughout life, and they're not just stagnant. Trust versus mistrust is the first one that you encounter. It's within the first year of life. I think that I probably ended up in the trust category because my mom was always home, so I imagine that my needs were met almost all the time, which is one of the key parts to me, trust over mistrust. The next one is autonomy versus shame/doubt, ages 1 to 3. I think I somehow ended up in the shame-doubt category. Somehow I always have been anxious and doubting myself for most of my life. It may not have been the case in younger years, but that's where I've been for the majority. So that possibly changed. Initiative versus guilt. I had a lot of guilt growing up. I tried to do initiative things, but I felt like I always messed up. And also I heard everybody else around me misbehaving and getting it wrong, and I then took on the guilt of their incorrect actions and felt the responsibility to behave in ways that were better than them. This again might have been developed later, but that's what it was for me. Industry versus inferiority is the next learning step. For me, I think I fall under the industry standard for the most part. I really love learning. I'm pretty good at it. I do have some inferiorities based on language, especially English and spelling. They're not something I succeeded at and struggle with till today. For identity versus identity confusion, during the developmental stage, I was definitely within identity confusion route. As soon as I tried on a new identity, I'd usually be bullied for it. And then by the time that I wasn't around people who were bullying me for it, I didn't know how to try things out and feel comfortable with it. It took me until probably my mid-20s to finally figure out everything for that. I'm currently in the intimacy versus isolation state. I used to be really into intimacy and people were my obsession, but that really doesn't work for me. And I actually really like being alone and not being around others or relying on them. So we'll see how this plays out in the future. With the generality versus stagnation, I have a feeling that I'm going to end up in the generality, but as I'm not that age yet, I'm not sure. I mostly think this because I'm working in a school and I hope that I continue to adapt to the needs and expectations of what I'm trying to do there. And also I have ideas and plans that can go beyond just being a special educator in a school. The final stage is integrity versus despair. I'm at least half my life away, according to the age milestones for this. Having the experience that I do, I currently despair about the future. Not necessarily about what I've done with my life up to that point, but more of the idea of I won't get to be this age because everything's going to fall apart, which isn't necessarily in line with Erikson's views and stages, but that's what I've got. So there you go. Vygotsky's theory is that societal and cultural norms heavily influence what and how we learn. For me, my society and my culture was heavily influenced on sustainability and respecting and understanding the earth. This also included hunting because I lived in a rural area and it was part of my family's heritage that hunting was important. It also meant that I grew to love dogs and other animals. I learned a lot about trees and plants and wildlife and the importance of our ecosystems and how they work. It also means that I learned how to bake goods really well and to know how to cook in general. Vygotsky also has the theory of the zone of proximal development, which is that we know some things are way too hard for us to learn, but there's this zone that is just outside of the knowledge that we have that is where we learn the best. This zone is also really influenced by those around us. So if you have a peer or an older mentor that you look up to that's helping you, you're going to do a lot better. For me, spelling is always in the zone of it's way too hard. I've worked really long and really hard to get to the point where I'm at, but for most of my developmental years, it was just out of reach for me. On the other hand, math was something I excelled at and easily understood. Usually I'd be the peer or mentor helping my friends. Understanding social norms that were not expressed openly was really hard for me and something that I still struggle with, while understanding patterns of behavior and understanding systems was something that came pretty easily to me, but it was always adapting and learning more about, which is why it's in my proximal zone. I also just have a love for learning and a drive to try to find out more. It's especially influenced when if somebody has a passion for something that I don't know about, I will then want them to tell me more about it so I can expand my knowledge and also learn more about what makes them happy. In Shaywitz's article, we look at how people with dyslexia use a different part of their brain when they are reading compared to those without dyslexia. It's noted that the area can change through intervention. Why this is relevant to me is because I learned that I have a brain cyst, Charlie. These are actual pictures of my brain, so I'm missing a chunk of my temporal lobe. My brain is atypical, and it might be using different areas for other functions than other brains typically do. Cross had this idea of the Black racial identity development model. It consisted of several stages of pre-encounter, encounter, immersion, internalization, and internalization commitment. Cross put all of these in the identity of Black identity development. In pre-encounter, they absorb beliefs based on the white culture that they were surrounded by. Encounter, they experience an impact of racism in their life, and they have to now deal with the fact that they are not white and they will not be white. Immersion is either drowning themselves in Black culture or completely rejecting everything to do with Black culture. Internalization is accepting who that they are. Internalization is accepting who they are as a Black person and how that connects with the relationships that they have both with Black peers and with white peers, and how to stand by their identity. Internalization commitment is the sense that they are who they are. It is sustained over time, and that they can have a positive outlook for their identity and want to help others establish this too. For me, I'm white, so this doesn't apply to me in the original description way. But for me, it more of I'm applying it to the queer identity that I have. My pre-encounter was that if you were different, that was bad. You had to be a boy or a girl. Everyone used gay as an insult in video games. The encounter one is a little bit more tricky. Probably when I was around 7, I realized that my nipples were shameful and bad while boys' nipples were fine, and I couldn't quite understand why. It took me about a decade after that to continue learning things, that people actually liked their body and felt connected to it, that not all girls liked girls. I encountered it more directly when I had a friend come out as non-binary and went to a school that had the saying, pack a day or gay by May. Immersion. At first I kind of doubted it and said, no, that's not me. I had a fear of liking one of my friends because her parents were lesbians, and I didn't want to be promoting a stigma that lesbians will raise lesbians, which is kind of messed up when I think about it now, but that's a thought I had to deal with. But for immersion, I learned everything that I could on wikis, went to my first Pride. We eventually figured out that pretty much all of my friends were queer in some capacity. Internalization, I'm now more openly using they, them, and trying to actually correct people about that. It's kind of internalized, but also it's not something that is super easy to be out about because not a lot of people understand it. If you search queer haircut, I've literally had that haircut for a while that is super stereotypically queer. And I've accepted that I'm not a girl, and I will tell people that I'm not a girl. So I live in Vermont, so I have to interact with the non-queer community quite a bit because there's not a lot of population here. So it's not that I can just go and envelop myself just in the queer community. I have to be involved with cis het people on the daily. And so I've gotten pretty good at relationships with queer and non-queer people. For my last stage of the internalization commitment, I've started giving a presentation at school about pronouns and gender identity. I'm beta testing a new name at the school, partially for my own needs, and also that way everyone else kind of has an understanding of how it can be done for if a student decides that they want to do that on a wider scale too. I've gotten really into disability Twitter, and I'm trying to help other people with their needs as well as mine. I'm trying to correct people on the best way to talk to others and talk about others. I've also changed my gender identifier on my license to X because that's a thing that we can do now. As with most of the different developments that we've gone over, there is research that proves that exposure to lead as a child can lead to higher aggression, an increase of health problems, and an increase in intellectual disabilities. For me, I didn't grow up in any houses that had lead paint or lead pipes for water, but I did grow up with a bunch of hunters. I have several memories of spitting out BBs from turkeys that my dad had shot, and that was just how it was. I also used lead BBs for shooting aerosol pistols and being told, hey, that's lead. Remember, you gotta wash your hands after this. To the level that this affected me, I don't know, because I don't believe I was ever tested for lead exposure as a kid, even though I was semi-exposed to it semi-regularly. It was just a part of the environment that I was in. As you can see here, though, with lead-based bullets, there is a lot of lead fracturing within an animal, so it's really nice that it's becoming more of a practice to use non-lead-based bullets, because this is a lot of lead exposure that people just don't need. I don't think that I'm done developing completely yet, and that there's more that I have to learn both about myself and about the world.